So today, I think that the only story I can tell you is to share my own story. And that begins in Tampico, Tamaulipas, where I was raised, a place that's glued to the past and very much anchored in machismo, in a structure of thinking and conducting themselves. My mother really tried to go to university, wasn't allowed. My father's a cardiologist and internist, has 15 years more of education than my mother. And for me, this intellectual disparity, it's an urgent matter. And I saw that so many women in my family, none of which were allowed to go to university, become housewives. And there's this strength and charisma and beauty about them in which how they held and sculpted the lives of the upcoming generation that felt so unappreciated and so much just, oh, the food's not ready, the kids are not fed. It wasn't a labor. It wasn't something with worth. It was just expected. And so for me, I wanted to frame my language of what I wanted to express as an artist, erasing that silence that I often felt was so strong when I was growing up. And I wanted to use the visuals of tango, something that a dance that I've been actually doing for over 10 years, in which there's that power symmetry. I know that oftentimes it's like dun dun dun, but it's actually incredibly symmetrical and structured. And the follower has to push as hard as the leader, and they move symmetrically, powerfully through the dance floor. And so I wanted to engage in this labor that I often saw the women in my family uphold and start depicting these actions. So I started doing performances, using the body as an exploration, as a measuring tool in private domestic spaces, because I was never able to get that line out of my gut when I first heard that men want a lady at the table and a whore in the bed. And I just knew that it resonated deep in me, and I was like, why can't we have both? Why can't I belong to both? And I started doing these performances that got translated into paintings, this one titled The Annunciation. Oftentimes the Virgin's told by Gabriel, the archangel. I felt that my mother put to death her own desires and willingness of wanting of self-exploration by choosing to have us. And so for me, there's a different reality. The shadow, like Carl Jung, being an active participant of the non-doing, the non-speaking, parts of us that we don't let ourselves explore. So trying to really instigate a way of, navigating spaces that are domestic that ask us, what is the worth of my body? Who has value? Who has access to an intellectual curiosity development? Who has the ability to explore different types of labor? Because so often I identified myself with the men in my family. When I was 10 years old, my parents moved us to San Diego, crossing this border, the San Diego-Tijuana border. And when I went to college, my mother was able to go back and begin studying archaeology, what was her passion. And then she picked up a camera and began documenting the border. And she's been documenting the border for over 15 years. And kind of like an archaeologist, really understanding the layers, the skin, not only the physicality of it, but also the social context of people and the stories, accumulating enormous amount of stories. And as I was here, and I had my first job in a cafe, I realized that I had always thought that women did this type of job. And having my first job, I understood that the men from Salvador, from the Mayan Peninsula, from Nicaragua, were the ones that were cleaning people's shit up along with me. And they had risked their lives to do this type of work and to go unrecognized and have these silent voices. And so for me, my mother approximated me physically to the border, and I began doing these performances there. And why painting? Well, for me, documentation of performance had almost always been video and photography. And there's been hundreds of years in which men had been, as Virginia Woolf very, very eloquently mentions it in A Room of One's Own, men have been depicting women's stories as lovers, as mothers, as sisters. And they're stylized, they're fictionalized. There's no autobiographies. And so for me, it was a way of creating this very fictitious medium, which was painting, in which so many men had done depictions of women, like angre, with like extra vertebrae to look beautiful. I wanted to do that performance myself, acted, painted, go through all those stages. And again, this shadow always being a kind of an active participant of like the stories in the background, that's the border of all the stories that go untold. In 2011, there was this mesh that got placed in Friendship Park, where families come from all over Latin America and the United States to come visit themselves. Sadly, with Obama, there's been the most amount of deportees ever under any president. And so now the families that are visiting themselves are families that have been separated from each other, that had been formed and had been living for 35 or more years. And when I saw this, I couldn't help myself. I wanted to take all that anger and that anguish that I had felt of hearing all these stories, and instead of doing something violent, I was like, why don't I use my weapon of painting and try and recreate or envision and paint the frame in which I want to see happen, which is to erase this wall that divides two countries, that divides so many families. And so one of the things that, as I was painting it, this runner came up to me, and I was almost finished, and he said, I get it. And I was on the top of the ladder, and I climbed down, and I was like, what do you get? He said, I thought for 1 second that this wall no longer existed. And it just was such an exciting notion to try and understand of like, could that be a reality? Could that be a reality? And again, in Nogales in 2015, I was invited, and we did it as a public engagement program. And at the same time of trying to erase entities as a way of bringing awareness, in September 26, 2014, 43 poor young men, students in the small town of Ayotzinapa, were kidnapped because they attempted, they did not disrupt, they attempted to disrupt a speech of the mayor's wife. The mayor gave the police orders to make them disappear. In the course of this human erasure, 3 bystanders were killed, 2 bodies found, 1 with the face burned off. The rest of the bodies are still missing. I remember that all of Mexico rushed to the streets and began protesting. How could this be this like outward act of violence, so heavy, so present? And everyone on Facebook was putting their profile pictures black. I wanted to become that black space. I wanted to mourn and really try and identify, why is it that these bodies have no value to our culture? Why is it that the government feels like they can be obliterated and erased so quickly? And so in doing so, I did this performance where I painted a room black, and I painted myself out black within this room as a way of mourning and paying luto, which is to mourn one's death for a year. And lastly, I think, after this, I realized that having done these projects, there was so much language being thrown at me at one point where I was called the Mexican Al-Qaeda, Mexican terrorist, because I had done this erasing the border piece. And I was asked by a bunch of different community members from Mexico to try and do this piece again. So I was like, why not treat it like warfare? I got together in 3 different states, in Mexicali, in Agua Prieta, Sonora, and also in Juarez. So that's in Mexicali, in Juarez. And we decided to do it like guerrilla warfare. In the morning, in these 3 locations, there are a bunch of community members that got together, painted out, and it was live streamed in 3 locations, and it was streamed in 10 different countries while we were doing it. And I'll leave you with this thought. This is a poem by Nagira Wahid. It's called Immigrant. You broke the ocean in half to be here, only to meet nothing that wants you. So my question to you is, what does feeling wanted by community look like? Thank you.